Tony, what else is on your mind, brother?
Well, I thought that it would be a good time to maybe talk a bit about the super trainers. We've glanced on the topic previously, but I also crunched a few numbers that I think are illuminating, and I wanted to talk about it. And also, just an interesting coincidence that you had an excellent show with Steve Christ recently. And I was very surprised when you mentioned the topic that he seemed to be relatively unconcerned about it. And well, I guess I'm surprised because I look at it differently. I think that it has been a big problem. I'm not suggesting there's any easy answer for it, far from it. But I think that it's worth thinking about in some depth in order to establish whether or not it really is a serious problem. It's not surprising that some people who employ the biggest trainers are defensive on this issue. But that's why I want to get into some of the numbers and some of the reasons why I think that it really is a serious problem and should be a focus of people who want to see the downward trajectory of the industry arrested and reversed, and hopefully sooner rather than later. So let me start by saying that it is true, as we all know, that full crops and the number of races run have both declined significantly since the year 2000. I'm using that as the 2000 to last year when we have a full range of statistics for all of these stats. They were done 2000 to 2023. So the full crop and number of races have both declined roughly 50% since the year 2000, big declines. Those are obviously variables that should be taken into account in any analysis of other changes in the industry over that period of time. But I think it's important that they not be taken at face value. For example, handle has also declined roughly 50% over that period in inflation adjusted dollars. But the correlation is clearly not evidence of causation. There were 33,000 races run in 2023. So any argument that the bettors have left the game or reduced their wagering significantly due to a lack of opportunities seems to be a non-starter to me. I would argue that to a large degree, the same is true of the changes in the trainer landscape. So here are some of the numbers that I came up with. In the year 2000, there were 500 trainers who saddled 200 or more starters. Last year, there were 300, a 40% decline. In 2000, there were 1,400 trainers that saddled 100 or more starters. Last year, there were 800, a 43% decline. In 2000, there were 1,800 trainers, roughly, these are within a few, that saddled 85 or more runners. And last year, the number was 950, so a 47% decline. To use an analogy of a broader economic framework, I would say that we could think about trainers who saddle between, say, 85 and 100 starters as being something along the lines of the heart of the middle class of the American racing game, meaning that, broadly speaking, they're able to make a living, but absent a good stakes horse or two or three, they're unlikely to be on anything like a path to riches. So if you take that as being reasonable, between 2000 and 2023, last year, there was a drop of 60% in the number of trainers who started between 85 and 100 runners. There were 500 in the year 2000 and 200 last year, a 60% decline. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, it's true that the sample sizes are small, but I still think that they're illuminating. There were in 2004 trainers that started 900 or more horses. Last year, there were 9 trainers, so a 56% increase. In 2000, there were 10 trainers with 700 or more starts. There were 14 in 2023. In terms of earnings, in the year 2000, there were 9 trainers whose runners earned in excess of $10 million inflation adjusted. In 2023, there were 14, a 36% rise. There was only 1 trainer in the year 2000 whose runners earned 20 million inflation adjusted dollars, and there were 4 last year. Again, those are small sample sizes, but you're still talking about a big increase in the number of horses in the hands of a small number of trainers. And of course, what's most meaningful about those small sample statistics is that there were big increases, which contrast significantly with the big decreases of the numbers of smaller to middle range trainers. So while the significant rise in the earning of the top trainers may also be related in part to inflated purses that are found at some tracks today, I think it's important to take into account that, again, to be consistent using inflation-adjusted dollars, there were $17 billion in purses in the year 2000, and in 2023, the number was $13 billion. So the inflated purses, while they've likely had some kind of impact, I would argue that the concentration of good stock into the hands of those fewer trainers has been the primary driver. Now, the other aspects, which I think are major aspects of this issue, which I've mentioned many times before, including, I think, in conversation with 2 of you, are that they have radically altered condition books and the abilities of racing secretaries to put together programs that would allow trainers to develop horses carefully. I know I'm being redundant, but I got into the game and did work closely with many trainers. I got into the game watching trainers, sensitive trainers, develop horses by breaking their maidens, putting them in A other thens, 2 other thens, 3 other thens, sometimes 4 other thens at a variety of different distances. And the ability to do that today is virtually non-existent.
Yep.
And although it's tangential, I would also add that the complaints about horses running so infrequently are not just related to reduced durability, but the fact that trainers have a much harder time planning out campaigns for their horses. And as you guys, I think, pointed out in our last podcast or a recent one, they miss a race and have no idea, when they're going to be able to find an appropriate race or the most appropriate race for the horse they're trying to develop. Big problem. Yep. The reduction in field sizes also definitely related to the super trainer phenomenon. And last but not least, all of these things have made the game far less interesting and attractive for bettors. We don't have to talk about the all too common situation like we found with the horses entered a week or 2 ago in California, where Baffert had 3 of the 5 entrants in a graded stakes race. It's not just the stakes races, the trainers who have the power of having so many horses and such a high percentage of the better stock are not, generally speaking, going to be running multiple horses in maiden and allowance races. They're going to be taking their times and picking their spots. And, that means that we're seeing less interesting races. And it's a problem. I'd like to hear what you guys think.
I got a couple of thoughts on that. The point about the condition book is a really good one. We have done a little podcast series for the West Point partners about the condition book, talking specifically about certain horses we've had who have like broken through two other than condition. They're not good enough to win at the 3X level, even if they write those races. They're not stakes horses, but they're high quality horses running buyers in the 80s, sometimes in the 90s. And we have no choice basically but to drop them in for a tag. And that's not fun for any of the partners to potentially lose their horses. But the condition book is such that if you have a horse that's 3X and they don't run those races and he can't compete in stakes company, where else are you going to go? The other thing is, you talked about the concentration in the hands of super trainers. I think that's the thing that really gets the goat of a lot of people who've criticized you recently, because this is like a put your money where your mouth is situation. Like I was watching the Mike Rapoli and Pat Cummings interview the other day. Mike Rapoli had this loose idea about like sending money to smaller owners or sending money to smaller trainers. And I just popped into my head, like, how about sending some horses to some smaller trainers, like the, teach a man to fish type deal. Like these guys don't want a handout. They just want horses and the opportunity to win some races without being surrounded by 4 Chad Brown horses or 3 Todd Pletcher horses or whatever it is in those races. And the other point I'll make is that it's in this, I'm sure you guys have seen this. It's a self-perpetuating thing where you send the best horses to the top trainers by money earned and by big races won. They're going to earn more money and win more big races. Like you send, like, look at John with Joe Orsino with Hades. Like, are you telling me that, and this is no disrespect to Mark Casse, who's obviously a Hall of Fame trainer. Are you telling me that if Mark Casse trained Hades, he would have won that race by 10 lengths instead of 2 lengths? Like, no, most guys at this level the difference is very, very small. And I think the same things can be said for jockeys. Like at the top level, the difference between the top 10, 15 guys is very, very small. I think the depth goes deeper down for the trainers, probably the top 100, 150 guys or so. But the point is the same, that if you give the people the opportunities, they know what to do. They're not idiots. And and I don't understand. One other thing is I don't understand, like I can kind of understand the Mike Rapolis and the Tom Ryans of the world sending all their horses to Bob Baffert or Todd Pletcher. What I don't understand is the guys below them, the guys that don't have 100 horses, the guys that maybe manage 15 to 20 horses, them sending their stock to these super trainers, because you're going to be put on the back burner automatically. Like those guys, just in the interest of preserving their own top business, are going to prioritize the horses from the major owners, and you're going to be like the 3rd or 4th choice when it comes to getting into a race. And like I said, I think it's a self-perpetuating thing where you have these guys in the spotlight winning big races, and a lot of people internalize that and think, well, if I want to win a big race, I got to go to one of these guys. And it's just not true. And there needs to be, like, I don't know, short of like redistributing the stock, which a lot of people will call communism, and it will not be open to that in this business. Like there needs to be like a re-education campaign or something to spotlight smaller and mid-level trainers and show, like, look, when you give them a good horse, they can get you there. They can win big races, but there's too much concentration in the hands of very, very few, and they kind of dictate the rules. And yeah, like you were saying, Tink, like the San Felipe was a perfect example. Like 3 Bob Baffert horses in the race, and we had to wait with Scatify to figure out who he was going to enter to see if we would run in that race or ship to another spot. Like he holds all the cards in California, and this is a year when his horses aren't even getting Derby points, and he still holds all the cards in all these prep races. And you have to get around these guys somehow. And not that John Sadler is a small trainer by any means, but he doesn't have the number power that Bob Baffert has. And it makes it so much harder for everybody else. And this is a situation where the guys who are, I think, most critical of you are the ones that are perpetuating the problem the most. And I think that's not a coincidence that they're criticizing you for this. Go ahead, John.
Joe, you stole my thunder a little bit with the Joe Orsino argument, but you're exactly right. I have changed my mind about this topic. If you asked me this question, with the super trainers, is it a problem in the industry? You had asked me when we were on the previous show, I would have said, hey, it's, you got to let the market dictate where these horses are going. And if people want to send horses to Baffert or Mott or Brown or Pletcher, that's their decision. If those trainers want to take those horses on, then it's a good marriage, and nobody else should be able to come into it. But what I'm seeing now that I'm on, being on the board of some of these racing groups, is that these races aren't going for the other trainers. And when you're a super trainer and you have 17 or 20 horses at that racetrack that are all eligible for the A other than, and you're only putting 2 in, well, there's 15, 20 other horses that are in your barn that also could fill that race. So it's a really difficult situation, because then not only aren't you running your other horses in your barn, but you're precluding other trainers from being able to run their horses because these races aren't going. So I've changed my mind on that. As far as, do you want to give all the horses to a super trainer? I understand the argument. And with the advent and the popularity of these smaller partnerships, the micro share partnerships, they have to, when they buy a horse, the majority of investors aren't going to know Uncle Mo from Uncle Bob. They don't know the pedigrees, but they sure as hell know if you're giving a horse to Bob Baffert, or if you're giving a horse to Steve Asmussen or Brad Cox, because those are the guys that are holding the trophies on most Saturdays. So from a sales standpoint, these partnerships have to lean into something. And the something is the people. And the people who are recognizable by the general public are these super trainers. So I understand where they're going with that. But we went ahead and we have the majority of our horses with Mark Casse, who is a 2-time Hall of Famer and probably is on. You can make the argument that he's a super trainer. Maybe he's just a notch below some of these other guys in terms of numbers. But we recognize that having all of our horses with one trainer didn't necessarily work for our program. And you're right, Hades, for example, who's undefeated on the Derby campaign, he may still be, lower on the totem pole in the grand scheme of things of Mark's horses. But for Joe Orsino, this is Joe's most important horse, and probably, I'm not going to speak for him, but it's his most important horse probably in a decade. And if he's not, if Joe doesn't text me every morning at like 6 or 7 in the morning giving me a Hades update, I worry, because I know that the first thing that he does when he goes into that barn is checks in on that horse. And not that Mark Casse or Bob Baffert or any of the other super trainers wouldn't be concerned about a horse that's, that won a Derby prep and is going to the Florida Derby, because they absolutely are concerned about that. But I know for Joe, that's the last thing that he thinks about before his head hits the pillow. And it's the first thing he thinks about when he wakes up. And that's empowering. That gives that trainer an opportunity then to promote his wares and do well on a national stage, and then get other horses potentially. And I think Cherie DeVoe is another good example of that, where she was a small trainer, didn't have a lot of stock coming in. A couple of groups gave her some horses. And, now she is certainly on the national stage. People know who she is. And it's easier for partnerships than to give a horse to someone like her, because now she has a public resume. The industry knew her resume, but she's got a public resume now that people can, hang on to, and it's saleable for what they want to do.